All right, welcome to our second video in our series on VisiCalc. In our previous video, we took the time to set up all of our classes, six Java files that we're using, one client, which we're calling VisiCalc, and then 5 helpers, grid cell, text cell, date cell, formula cell. All we needed to do in the first checkpoint was have a user input loop. If we were asked for help, we got a help menu. If we quit, it quit the program. If it wasn't help or quit, it echoed whatever our input was back to the console. And in checkpoint 2, we want to take the next step. And the next step is we got to be able to visually represent the grid of information. Okay, so I'm actually not going to show any of my code now because that would be just giving you a solution and robbing you the joy of planning it yourself. But I'm going to show you the results of my code. So when I fire up my program, it says, welcome to VisiCalc. I can still say help. I could still say quit. But echo has been removed. And in its place, I'm now looking for different commands. And the only command it can see now, this new command, is called print. And when I call print, it prints the grid nicely to the screen. Now, again, this will probably feel like an opportunity that you can provide some artistic flair. I want to make clear the rules about printing. Number 1, I need your columns to be letters. I need your rows to be numbers. Number 2, we go A through G, that's 7 columns, and 1 through 10, that's 10 rows. Those are non-negotiable. If you want to use different symbols to break things up, that's totally fine. But the other constraint I'm going to require is that these blank boxes right here be 7 spaces. There's a reason for this. I'm going to force us to do something called truncating, where we take an output that is too large and we make it fit in the box. For instance, if you said a long piece of text, that I only want to see the first 7 characters of that text, but that's a problem for checkpoint another day. And frankly, that's it. That's all that checkpoint 2 is. Now, I'm going to make some notes over here in the planning document to get you started. Some students, when they hear, hey, all you need to do is print the grid, they think to themselves, oh, that's easy. For the price of maybe 20 print statements, I'll just puke the grid out and we'll be set to go. Well, that's fairly useless. You know, just writing 20 consecutive print statements, that's something we could have done in the first week of the course. We are 9 chapters deep in now. And what I'm really looking for when I talk about printing the grid, I'm looking for you to I want to access the spreadsheet field of the grid object, and we'll talk about the right way to do that in a second. And I'm looking for a nested for loop to traverse the spreadsheet and access each element. Whew. Okay, what does that mean? Well, let's break things down one at a time. First, you're going to need to make a grid object somewhere in your code to reference. I recommend putting grid in the VisiCalc class. That's our client. I have as a global variable, I said grid G equals new grid. Because VisiCalc's the client, because the main method, all the associated methods are static, if I try to refer to this global variable G in any of my methods that are static, it's going to require that it also be static. I know I caution us all against chucking static against things to make the red lines go away, to make your code compile. I'm giving you permission now. It's okay for the one grid object that's the global variable in VisiCalc to be static, because we only have the one grid that we're working with for this particular project, so that's okay. The reason we make it a global variable is if I have different methods in VisiCalc that want access to it, perhaps it would be better designed to declare the grid object in the one method and continue to pass it and return it as parameter and returned value. This is already a hard enough project, and I don't want to incur that level of difficulty for right now. So that's what we're going to start with number 1. Number 2, I guess I actually don't have to make these comments if this is a text field. Number 2, how do we traverse this thing, right? How do we do it? And where are we going to put this method? Well, I think students have different ideas for what they want to do. And this challenge of figuring out the correct location for the print grid method is the kind of thing that a professional programmer does. You can imagine there's a relationship between these 6 classes, and we want to know whose job should it be to print the whole grid. Well, right away, I'm going to eliminate cell and all of its children. And the reason is cells are these individual objects. They hold the value that we've placed there. And so why, if they can't see the whole grid, why make them responsible for printing the whole grid? And so that makes sense. These are too small. They're not at the level of scale that we would need to be able to print. So this brings us down to whose job should it be to print grid? Should it be the grid or VisiCalc? It's a choice I'll let you make. I will offer my advice, which is if it can be done lower down, and by lower down, I don't mean in the inheritance hierarchy. I mean if a VisiCalc has a grid and a grid has a cell. And so you've got, this class owns this object and this class owns this object. If VisiCalc doesn't need to know about it, if it can be handled by one of VisiCalc's fields, let that object handle it. VisiCalc's going to be busy enough performing our user input loop and a whole bunch of other methods. If it doesn't need to have it, let's put it in grid. So then the question becomes, geez, how do you... we're going to be in grid. We're going to be referring to our spreadsheet field that's there. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the first video. How do I go visit all of the cells in spreadsheet and print their contents? Well, let me offer this nested for loop as a piece of advice. We know that when we're traversing a two-dimensional array, we use nested for loops. We know that the outer loop controls the row and the inner loop controls the column. So that means I'm going to say for int I equals 0, I less than, what's my number of rows, right? We always do row then column. The outer loop is row, the inner loop is column. I less than 10. 10 rows in our output over here. I++. Okay, this ensures that I run 10 times. And I'll close it right there. The next thing I'm going to say, except, I went against what I was going to do. I like, if you're traversing a two-dimensional grid, I like R and C for row and column. It just reinforces to me what it is I'm trying to do. Okay, the next thing I would say is we're going to go visit all the columns in C equals 0. Let's see here, int C equals 0. C less than, how many columns do we have? 7. And C++. Okay. The cool thing that we have done here is we have built a nested for loop that's going to have every combination of row and column index, right? It's going to go, all right, row 0, column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It'll finish looking at the first row. The inner loop will conclude. The outer loop will say, all right, row was 0. Now update it. Row is now 1. And so we'll drop down to the next row and we'll go across, right? So how do I refer to each of these cells? I'm going to refer to them as spreadsheet of row column. But here's the issue. And I think we probably talked about this very briefly, so this is a refresher. When I declared spreadsheet, which I'll just go ahead and show that code again. When I said a two-dimensional array of cells called spreadsheet that is a new array of cells of, let's see here, it had 10 rows and 7 columns. Okay. You might think that this spreadsheet now is chock full of brand new cell objects, but it actually isn't. Right now, in all 70 of these spaces, there aren't cell objects. It's all null. It's like we paved the parking lot and we have yet to park any cars here. So the question is, okay, well, if everything is null, if there's no values to be reported, what exactly is it you want me to do? And what I'm asking is make your nested for loop. Make sure it asks for each individual cell, and you can check. You can use a little bit of conditional logic. You can say like, look, if spreadsheet of RC, if the location you're looking at currently has no car parked in it, which means, hey, it's null. There's nothing there. Then we can just print some spaces. Okay. Now this is going to be true for this checkpoint. We're not dropping any cells in here, so we don't have to worry about it. In the future, you're going to say, all right, look, if this thing's not null, I got to worry about pulling some value out of it. Spreadsheet of RC, go get that value. This is for future checkpoints. You don't have to worry about it right now. So I'm giving you this code as a leg up to start with. But the challenge you're going to have is, this by itself would just print a grid of 70 spaces. You wouldn't be able to see anything. I need you to print out the column headers. I need you to print out the row headers. We got to get the dashes. We got to get these vertical pipes. I need you to have the formatting looking exactly like this and ready to go. So while you are making your nested for loop, whose job it is to access every cell, check to see if there's something there, and if there's nothing there, go ahead and print out some spaces. You also got to do a whole bunch of formatting. So the last thing I'll remind you is it can be pretty convenient to use printf, system.out.printf. Remember, printf is like print in that it doesn't go down to the next line. You can include symbols like %d for a digit, %s for a string, %f for a float. So the types here would be maybe an int or a string or a double. And then whatever arguments you provide, you must provide whatever your int value is here. Maybe it's 7, or your string value here is hello, and your float value here is 3.14. That's how that works. Remember, what makes printf cool is it allows us to do a little bit of formatting. For example, if I say, hey, print me out a digit, and sometimes that digit is a single digit, and sometimes that digit is a 2-number digit, whatever it is, it needs to take up a minimum of 2 spaces. So 7, unfortunately, is always a 7. That's not going to work. But if this was a variable of some kind, I don't know, say like r, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, or maybe r+1, hint, hint. What this lets me do is this says, just so the formatting is not off on each row, make sure you always take up 2 spaces. So when I printed this 1, it took up 2 spaces here. 10 already took up 2 spaces, so it didn't need to add anything for it. For printing the contents of each cell, remember each cell is 7 spaces wide. Printf can also be handy for that. If printf is driving you crazy and you don't want to deal with it, don't worry about it. You can ignore it. All right, so in summary, checkpoint 2 is about printing the grid. Please do not just make 21 static print statements that don't do anything. Take the time to make a grid object as a global variable in VisiCalc. Make a print grid method. I'm going to recommend you do it in grid, but there'd be no harm in doing it in VisiCalc if you wanted. And then use nested for loops to visit every cell and determine how you want to print that out. This lays the groundwork for checkpoint 3, which is all about, okay, I want to be able to put an individual number in these cells, and now I've got the means to do it. I know how to print it to see if it works correctly. Okay, thanks for watching.